My brother called me the family parasite during Christmas dinner, while wearing the designer jacket I bought him. I laughed, clinked my glass, and said nothing. 3 days later, the family business accounts were locked. Why? Because I'm not just the silent partner. I'm the sole owner. And I just sold everything. My name's Marcus. I'm 38 years old. Grew up in suburban New Jersey, and I've lived in Chicago for the past decade. By trade, I'm a financial analyst. Numbers and spreadsheets are my comfort zone. I'm not flashy. I drive a 7-year-old Honda, wear plain button-downs to the office, and I binge true crime podcasts in my free time. Behind that mild exterior, though, I've always been the one my family underestimated. The geeky kid who read balance sheets for fun, the quiet younger brother who smiled politely while they took all the credit. Our family business, Reynolds and Sons Construction, was started by my grandfather in the late 70s. My dad, Richard, joined straight out of college. My older brother, Patrick, followed 10 years later. I helped out in summer breaks but never had ownership. At least not on paper. Everyone assumed I had my fill of inheritance, that I'd be happy playing second fiddle. I let them think that. I didn't correct their assumptions. After all, it suited me to stay in the background. Christmas at my parents' place has always been a big affair. 20+ relatives converging on the old Victorian, in Montclair, tree towering to the ceiling, lats and roast beef side by side, the fire roaring. This year I flew in from Chicago on the morning of the 23rd. I'd brought gifts: a rare bottle of scotch for Dad, hand-knit scarves for the nieces, and the Pi CDRA assistants. A limited edition leather jacket for Patrick. Something he'd been drooling over since it debuted online. I'd splurged without hesitation. He'd spent half his salary upgrading his classic car, and always complained about feeling underappreciated. When I arrived, the mood was as festive as ever. We exchanged hugs, I handed out presents, and the cousins jostled for the first taste of eggnog. Later, around the long mahogany table, my dad made his customary toast to family unity. Plates clinked. Lauder drifted over the hummus and gravy. And then Patrick slipped on my gift, the designer jacket, and, without missing a beat, looked over at me and said, "Nice of you to buy me a jacket, Parasite. Don't think I've forgotten who bankrolls your whole life." The room went quiet. My mother's fork hovered halfway to her mouth. My aunts exchanged glances so fast I could almost see the panic. Even the toddlers stopped playing. I took a breath, lifted my glass, a modest pour of whiskey, and simply said, "To family." Then let the amber liquid slide down. I didn't mention that he was wearing a gift I'd paid for, or that he'd been calling me lazy. For the last year I let the barb hang. He smirked, sat down, and everyone else forced polite laughter. Dinner resumed, but the atmosphere felt brittle, like looking at a cracked mirror. That night, I slipped out early, claimed jet lag, and went back to my brother's childhood room, now my designated guest room, and stared at the ceiling with heavy eyelids. I replayed the insult over and over, wondering how Patrick could be so cruel at the company Christmas party next week. Because if he brought it there, the entire board would hear it. Worse, our clients might catch wind. Reputation mattered in construction more than you'd think. On the drive back to Chicago 3 days later, my phone rang. My lawyer's name flashed. I braced for something about taxes or an accident at the site. Instead, he said, "Marcus, the Reynolds and Sons accounts have been locked. You're listed as sole owner. The shares Patrick and your dad thought they held have just been transferred." I eased off the accelerator. He explained that my initial investment, seed money from my first job, was never simply a loan. It was classified as equity with voting rights. Voting rights had never been exercised. Until now. I pulled over, heart hammering. Patrick's face flashed in my mind, the smug grin under my leather gift. Dad's concerned voice when he called me last week. The board had issued a simple resolution: dissolve the old structure and sell to a private equity firm. The deal was done. Checks had been cut. I would personally handle the distribution. Their inheritance, their livelihood, their pride. It would vanish with the final signature. I pocketed my phone, started the car again, and looked out at the gray highway stretching toward home. Christmas had ended with laughter and family cheer. But the real gift was just arriving. One they'd never see coming. The morning after I locked the family business accounts, my phone lit up with frantic texts. Dad, Patrick, even my Aunt Karen. All demanding explanations. I sat in my Chicago apartment with a single cup of coffee and let them implode. Dad left a voicemail saying he'd take a train up to figure things out. Patrick blasted me with messages calling me a traitor, A backstabber. A cold-hearted bastard. None of it surprised me. I had planned for every reaction. First, I secured the deal details. The private equity firm I'd been quietly courting for 6 months transferred funds into an escrow account, pending my signature. I reviewed the purchase agreement at dawn, line by line, identifying every clause that protected me from future claims. I forwarded the signed documents to my lawyer, then wrote brief emails to the board, and to every major clientele effective, immediately. Reynolds and Sons Construction would operate under new ownership. Projects would continue uninterrupted. Payments and invoices were now handled by Clear Lake Partners. A name nobody would recognize on the street, but everybody respected in the boardroom. By noon, Patrick had shown up at our father's office, only to find the locks changed. He called me from outside, voice cracking, demanding to know what I'd done. I texted back, "Your stake was bought out at market value. If you check your inbox, you'll see the payment confirmation." No apology, no remorse. Just facts. He went silent. I imagined him reeling as he stared at an empty office, the nameplate still on the door, but nothing behind it. Dad called. Next. He tried to reason, telling me I was destroying a legacy, built by 3 generations. I listened, then reminded him of the family meeting 3 years ago, when he promised to buy me in on the partnership. He'd said he needed to see how I handled things. First. I told him I'd handled things. Fork in hand, I responded exactly like I did at Christmas, to family. Then I hung up. That night, I flew back to New Jersey. I arrived at the Old Victorian just after sunset. The windows glowed with Christmas lights that fut out of place in January. I walked up to the front door and found Dad waiting, face drawn gray. Instead of anger, he looked tired. Patrick hovered behind him, arms folded, jacket still missing my gift tag. They invited me into the living room, where my mother sat clutching a mug of tea, tears on her cheeks. No one spoke. I set my carry-on by the couch and waited. Finally, Dad stood and said his piece. How he'd sacrificed, how the business was their bond. How I'd shattered it. Patrick echoed his outrage, accusing me of turning my back on blood. I only nodded once. Then I pulled out my phone and opened the escrow statement. I slid the tablet across the coffee table. Line by line, they watched the numbers: my equity, their buyout amounts, the transfer of ownership, the projected future growth under Clear Lake. The numbers didn't lie. When they realized their accounts were cleared and that the money had hit their bank, they looked at each other, stunned. Patrick's mouth hung open. Dad's shoulders slumped. My mother whispered, You actually did it." I took a deep breath and said, "It took 10 years of being underestimated. Merry Christmas, by the way." I packed up my tablet, patted my father on the shoulder, and walked out. Outside, the January air was sharp. I got into a cab without looking back. In my pocket, my phone buzzed with a headline notification. Reynolds and Sons sold overnight. Industry in shock. I smiled. Behind me, the lights of the house twinkled. Ahead of me, my future unfurled with every mile toward the airport. I landed back in Chicago 2 days after that tense living room showdown. By then, the story had blown up online construction forums, LinkedIn threads, even the local business journal ran a weekend expose. They painted me as a cold opportunist, the villain who betrayed his own blood. A few corners of the internet cheered me on, calling it just desserts for a family that always overlooked me. Mostly, though, it was a storm of outrage. I drifted into the office, now Clear Lake's gleaming high-rise suit, where my new team had already begun restructuring. I oversaw payroll transfers and supplier reassignments, but my mind kept twisting back to home. That night, I received a voicemail from my mother. Her voice trembled. She'd collapsed at Patrick's place, taken to the ER with chest pains. The guilt cut through me, ice cold. I booked the earliest flight back. At the hospital, she greeted me with tears streaming down her cheeks, clutching my hand as though I were the only anchor left in her world. Even in her pain, she whispered that she'd always been proud of me. My dad hovered nearby. His posture stooped from years of shouldering the business. He told me between labored breaths that Patrick hadn't spoken to him since their deposit cleared. He didn't have the heart to tell him the bank statement had no mortgage left, and that the house itself was collateral in a loan I'd quietly taken out to secure the deal. Patrick was furious. He showed up at the hospital at midnight, storming into my mother's room wearing that designer jacket. It still had the gift tag tucked in the pocket. He flung it at me. I caught it reflexively. He spat that I'd ruined his life, stolen away his legacy and left them destitute. I looked at the jacket, remembered wrapping it in tissue paper, and felt the old anger flare. I gave that to you, I said, voice low. You called me a parasite while wearing it. His face twisted. That was a joke. Then his voice cracked. Do you know what you've done? We're bankrupt. Everything I built is gone. I let him rage. Nurses peered in. I didn't stop him. After he finished, chest heaving, I spoke. I never sold your legacy. I sold the business you never valued me enough to share with me. The buyout check cleared. You've got your money. $500,000 for you, Dad, after taxes. More than you ever let me earn on my own. I'm not your bank machine anymore. I'm the banker. He staggered back as though I'd struck him. Mom squeezed my hand, tears still falling, and whispered that she loved me. Dad looked at me with something like admiration tangled in his grief. But the real shock came 2 nights later. My assistant called me from the Clear Lake office. Marcus, you need to see this. They patched me into a live stream of Patrick on a local radio show, ranting about the greedy little brother who'd sold us out, warning clients that their projects would crumble under corporate oversight. He played audio clips of him telling clients that Clear Lake only cared about profit. He urged them to pull out before materials were purchased and permits filed. Standard industry tactics for a smear campaign. My stomach twisted. He was burning bridges, not just with me, but with every contractor, architect, and supplier who'd ever worked with Reynolds & Sons. If enough of them pulled their contracts, Clear Lake would be stuck with half-finished sites and sunk costs. I watched the caller lines light up in protest. At night, I decided on retaliation. I went to our old office records. Vaulted contracts, project blueprints, lien waivers. I found a clause in our founding bylaws from my grandfather's time. If any partner publicly disparaged the company, all non-operating shares would be forfeited back to the majority owner. It was obscure, but legally sound. I sent a single email to Clear Lake's legal department. Initiate Clause 12B, forfeit Patrick's shares. Notify the board for immediate notice. Then I forwarded a copy to Patrick's personal email with the subject line, your move. Within 12 hours, his ownership vanished. His buyout payment became voidable, the $500,000 returned to escrow pending his cease and desist. Overnight, he lost not just legacy but bloodline privilege. I sat in my apartment watching the confirmation ping through my phone. A quiet moment of grim satisfaction. The next morning, the radio host returned to break the news. Patrick no longer had any stake in the business he'd been slandering. Furious callers flooded the station, divided between sympathy and condemnation. Patrick's voice broke as he tried to explain that it was a misunderstanding, that the clause was unfair. The host cut him off. Rules are rules, Patrick, you broke them. Meanwhile, my inbox filled with new contracts. Clients who'd panicked now scrambled to secure their sites, thanking me for stabilizing the company. I drafted a press release. Clear Lake Partners affirms commitment to continuity. Marcus Reynolds, founder and majority owner, guarantees completion on every project under original terms. I hit send and poured myself a shot of whiskey. As I raised the glass, I felt the full weight of what I'd done. I'd outplay them in every turn: Christmas insult, corporate coup, legal counterpunch. The house in Montclair was still in Dad's name, for now, but I had the leverage to protect it. Patrick had the jacket, but I had the company. And more importantly, I had the last laugh. That night, I called Mom. She answered, voice shaky, and I told her to rest. I'm sorry, I said. But don't ever call me a parasite and got away with it. She laughed at a weak, proud sound. I smiled, thinking of the road ahead, messy, uncertain, but mine to drive. I woke up to an avalanche of news alerts. The lawsuit was filed. Patrick had gone to court, accusing me of hostile takeover, seeking an injunction to reverse the sale. He claimed I'd violated fiduciary duty, called in expert witnesses to testify that my actions were malicious and underhanded. The local business journal ran a banner. Family food of the century. My phone buzzed nonstop. Clients asking if the company was in legal jeopardy, reporters demanding interviews, social media accounts reposting clips of Patrick's radio meltdown. I stared at my reflection in the glass tower's window. Steel, blue suit, calm expression, but the knot in my stomach betrayed me. I sent a terse email to Clear Lake's legal team. Prepare defense and countersuit. Emphasize clause 12B. Then I called my lawyer. I want to go on offense. Draft a motion for sanctions against Patrick for frivolous litigation. And subpoena his bank records. I want to scan every transaction since December. At noon, the courtroom showdown began. Patrick strutted in, shoulders squared, brandishing legal pads like armor. His attorney harangued the judge with dramatic flourishes, portraying me as a villain who duped his own kin. When the judge asked me to speak, I stood and laid out the timeline. My initial investment agreement, the board resolution, the escrow instructions, the obscure bylaw clause. I projected each document onto the screen behind me. The room went quiet as the judge scrolled through the emails. The resolution minutes, the clause that clearly spelled forfeiture for disparagement. It was all airtight. Patrick's face drained color. His attorney sputtered, flipping through papers. But there was nothing left to argue. When the gavel fell, the judge denied Patrick's motion, awarded me legal costs, and granted my request for sanctions. Patrick's shares remained forfeited. The press captured every stunned expression. Leaving the courthouse, cameras flashing, I felt something shift. Vindication. Yes, but also a hollow ache. Inside, my family was unraveling. My mother had stopped visiting my apartment, sending flowers to Dad's place instead. Patrick's relationship with our parents was fracturing beyond repair. My phone, once a tool, had become a weapon. I needed to choose my next move carefully. That evening, I found a voicemail from Mom. Her voice was measured, distant. She was afraid Patrick might retaliate further, that the family name would be tarnished forever. She wanted peace. I called her back. I told her I'd arranged a trust fund to cover their living expenses and medical bills. No strings attached. Just a gesture to rebuild what I'd broken. She cried on the line. Called me her miracle child. I hung up feeling the weight of that praise more intensely than any victory. The next morning, I got a mail from Patrick's lawyer. They were dropping the countersuit. Patrick was suing me personally for emotional distress, but they'd file in civil court later. Another tactic to drag me through litigation. I forwarded the email to my counsel with one line. Settle it. I'll pay him half of his legal fees if he signs a non-disparagement agreement within 48 hours. By afternoon, an agreement landed in my inbox. Patrick agreed to a mutual non-disparagement clause, an NDA covering all parties, a confidential settlement. He waived any future claims. I signed electronically, feeling a surge of relief. That night, I sat alone in my high-rise apartment, city lights shimmering below. I poured myself a glass of scotch. The same rare bottle now half empty, and raised it to the skyline. I'd won. I'd avenged the insult at Christmas and outmaneuvered every legal ambush. But as the liquid burned down my throat, I realized the true cost I faced my family's trust for control. The family business was gone, sold to strangers. The Reynolds name would live on, but without our blood at the helm. My phone pinged with a message from Dad. Can we talk? I stared at it, and after a long moment, typed back. Tomorrow. Bring coffee. I powered down my phone, slid open the balcony door, and breathed in the cold night air. The city hummed around me, indifferent to my triumph, or my sorrow. I knew one thing for certain: the war had ended. But whether I'd won or lost was still up for debate. The morning after I finalized Patrick's settlement, I sat in my apartment staring at the city skyline, the echo of champagne glasses still ringing in my head. It was over. Or so I thought. Then my phone buzzed with a Bloomberg notification. Reynolds and Sons Construction acquired by Artisan Builders. The headline read. Artisan Builders was a small, employee-owned firm in Minneapolis with a sterling reputation. I'd approached them 6 months ago under an alias, pitched the idea of a merger that would preserve the Reynolds name and safeguard every employee's job. They agreed, sight unseen, as long as I handled the closing details. I tapped the article, and read that Artisan would honor every existing contract, offer equity shares to every Reynolds employee, and rename the company Reynolds Artisan Collective. My stomach twisted with pride. I hadn't just sold my birthright for profit. I'd liberated the business from family drama and handed it to the people who'd built it with their sweat and skill. Patrick and Dad would have no shares, no board seats, no veto power. The company would live on, but under a new stewardship that actually deserved it. I forwarded the Bloomberg link to my parents and Patrick's lawyer with a single line. Merry belated Christmas. Oh, I didn't give them a chance to respond. Instead, I booked a flight back to New Jersey, suitcase in tow, eager to see their faces when reality hit. I arrived at the Old Victorian just before dusk. The house was dark, the decorations long since packed away. I knocked once. Dad opened the door, pale and drawn. Patrick stood behind him, arms crossed, his designer jacket hanging limply over one arm. Mom peered over his shoulder, confusion etched in her eyes. I stepped inside and placed my phone, still showing the Bloomberg article, on the hallway table. Dad picked it up with trembling fingers. He scrolled while Patrick leaned in close, peering over his shoulder. When they both looked up at me, their faces had gone slack. I let the silence stretch. Finally, I said, "There's no business left to buy back. Artisan Builders takes over tomorrow. Every employee gets shares. Everyone's paid out. The name stays. Just with people who earned it." I watched comprehension give way to outrage in Patrick's eyes. Dad stared at the screen as though it were a confession, not a news story. Patrick ripped into me, screaming that I've destroyed their legacy, thrown them to the curb, stolen everything. Dad tried to calm him, but Patrick wouldn't stop. He grabbed the jacket from my mother's arm and flung it at me. "Even this gift you used as bait." I caught it absently, looked at the label inside, then shook my head and tossed it into the corner. I took a deep breath. "You both had your payout. $500,000 each. More than you ever let me earn. You can buy your own legacy now." I turned to my mother, who was wiping tears away. I knelt and took her hand. "I didn't sell our family for profit. I sold it so it could actually matter. To the people who live it every day." She nodded, tears still flowing, but there was something like pride in her eyes. I stood, pockets empty, legacy relinquished. The house felt smaller. The air heavier. But in my chest there was a fierce lightness. I'd played every card, executed every move, and then given it all away. The Reynolds name would continue. Not as my family's personal ATM or trophy, but as a collective enterprise shared by workers who had earned it. Patrick stormed out, jacket forgotten on the couch. Dad watched him go. Shoulders slumped as if he had aged a decade in an hour. My mother reached out and hugged me. I felt her heart beating fast, relief and confusion tangled together. Outside, dusk settled over Montclair. I walked to my car without looking back. In my rearview mirror, I saw the house's lights flick on for a moment. Warm, but under a sky forever changed. I drove away, knowing two things. First, no one would ever call me a parasite again. Second, I didn't need a business to prove my worth. I had already shown that I was, and always had been, the one truly in control. Either way, thanks for listening. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, honest, messy human, go ahead and subscribe.